Time now for this discussion entitled "How far does GB gambling reform need to go?" I'm joined in the studio by Matt Zarb-Cousin, advisor of YieldSec, and Charles Cohen, the CEO of the Department of Trust. Welcome both to the studio.
Hello. Thank you.
Our new studio for this year. We were just talking about the differences from last year. Are you enjoying it?
It's very smart. It feels like what I'm told the first-class lounge feels like at the airport.
That's true. I haven't compared it to that yet. Okay.
Do we get free coffee there?
Yeah, we're working on that. Maybe
Okay.
next year. So the Gambling Commission estimates that 430,000 people are experiencing some form of problem gambling. How far do we think that, what do you think that reform needs to go?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that even though that 430,000 figure gets bandied about a lot, the degree of gambling harm extends way beyond that. Obviously, there's about 2 million people that are at risk, and obviously those people their gambling impacts up to 12 other people on average. So the harm does extend into the millions, and I think that it's really important that we recognise that there are things we can do with regulation and things we can do with technology that can reduce that and can prevent it in some cases, in many cases. And I think this gambling review at the moment is just, it's really about upgrading our legislation, upgrading our gambling laws so they're fit for the digital age. So things like stake limits on online slots where the vast majority of harm takes place, things like affordability checks, things like a levy to pay for research, education and treatment. All of these things can contribute to reducing gambling-related harm. And I think it really should be the aspiration of the sector and of the regulator to get that number down to as low as possible. And I think it can be done. And really that will enable the sector to be sustainable, because not only on a commercial level are they reliant at the moment on, or the operators reliant on people losing more than they can afford, but on a political level, that's also unsustainable. So, it does lead to backlash. We've seen it in every market. So if the sector wants to have that operation in the long term and wants to be around and avoid draconian pushback from regulators, then it has to embrace that, I call it journey to 0% from revenues from gambling-related harm. And there are some operators that are talking about that already.
And what about you, Charles?
Well, I think Matt used the key word, is sustainability. The industry was last reformed, and when I say reformed, it was actually formed after the 2005 Act. It was before the smartphone even existed. And so everything has changed since then, and it's clearly unsustainable in its current form. And I think that the gambling harm that actually is now something that we can measure much more than we ever used to be able to, and so we've got a better sense of the scale of it. It's an externality. It's like the pollution, if you like, that's caused by the industry. And I think, like any other sector, once society comes to realize that, then it has to act. But the sustainability principle, I think, is the key one. So the answer to the question is, reform needs to go as far as absolutely necessary and no further than it needs, because otherwise you start to create damage the other way. Striking that balance is not an easy thing, but I get the sense that actually the industry almost has reached a point of exasperation itself and wants the reform in order to put themselves on a more sustainable footing, because they don't want to spend their lives looking over their shoulders. And also they can't hire people into environments where people don't want to go to work knowing that they're committing a product that's harming people, and it's no good for anybody.
Sustainability really is the buzzword of the 21st century, isn't it? So some of the largest operators have self-imposed responsible gambling behaviour or measures in the last few years. Do you think that this proves that the industry can self-regulate?
I think it proves that they realise there's a problem and that something needs to be done. And for them, particularly the listed companies, it's an existential issue. If they don't do something about it and get to grips with it, then some of the more, I'd say more the operators on the more progressive end, like Flutter, for example, realise if they don't do something about it, then they might not be around in 10 years' time because there'll be a huge backlash. The problem is, an operator can't really address this problem unilaterally. It has to be measures that are implemented across the sector by the regulator that level the playing field. Otherwise, you end up with this go next door problem. So one operator might, for example, restrict someone on the basis of affordability, and unless that data is shared, unless you have a proper perspective of that person's gambling across the licensed and regulated sector, then that person will just go to another operator. So absolutely needs regulation. It needs the regulator to get on the front foot and to embrace technology and enact that across the sector. And then there'll be no disadvantage for operators doing these kind of things that will lead to their own sustainability, doing things that reduce gambling-related harm.
It's impossible for an operator because they've got an internal conflict between the need to generate revenue and the need to actually sacrifice some of that margin for safe and responsible gambling and protecting their customers. And there's a really good analogy that I've heard people use more than once, is about the seatbelt. That when, I think it was Volvo that invented the seatbelt, and the first thing they did was they open sourced the technology. But still, manufacturers did not install seatbelts in their cars until they were told to. And there was all this hocus about, oh, well, if you put seatbelts in cars, it'll encourage people to drive faster, which wasn't true. But I think gambling regulation in this area is exactly the same. So because the companies have a commercial incentive not to do this, they will continue to act in this way. I mean, some of them will be responsible and they will stick their necks out, and they can explain that to their shareholders. But it's much better for everybody if they're all held to the same rules and standards. And also, by the way, it's better for the player. I mean, we see players who, they get blocked from one site, or they get limited on one site, and then they can just simply go and open an account at another site and carry on going. And it's like a sort of a merry-go-round of gambling harm until you run out of sites, and then you end up offshore somewhere where no one's going to ask you any questions about anything ever. And that, so it doesn't help anybody, this situation. The sooner the reform comes in, the better.
Now, there's obviously a lot of discussion around the affordability checks at the moment. You just referenced them, Matt. Do you think they are necessary?
Well, at the moment, operators are expected to do them anyway. So this is where I think the debate has become a bit muddied. So there's already an obligation to do the checks for anti-money laundering purposes at like £2,000 a day or whatever it is. And they're already supposed to do affordability checks for safer gambling purposes. The Gambling Commission just hasn't been very prescriptive about that. They've taken enforcement action and they've issued fines where there's been clear breaches of social responsibility, but they've not been prescriptive about when the checks should take place, how they should take place, what data should be requested, how that data should be shared, how affordability should be, like how we should calculate affordability. And that's what's needed. And really, for me, this is a technical question. It's a question of, like, what's the metric that we're using and how can we enact it across the sector? And I feel like that component in the debate has sort of been lost a bit around this kind of nebulous and amorphous debate around freedom and all that kind of stuff. Really, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about when these checks should take place and how they should take place and standardising that across the sector.
So actually, Scully, who was the gambling minister the day before yesterday, made a very important speech a week or so ago, where he said, it's not about affordability checks, it's about financial risk. And that was actually quite a profound shift, because affordability checks mean something very, very specific in the context of credit decision making. And all of the work and the thinking about affordability is derived from that. And actually, financial risk and financial vulnerability is a much more useful metric for the gambling industry, because it encourages you to look at a much more nuanced picture of somebody's life and not have to make the kind of sort of quasi-moral judgments around affordability. Because the problem with affordability was it very quickly becomes you trying to say, well, you should spend less on gambling and more on vegetables. You know, that's the individual's choice. But somebody who's on benefits, somebody whose income has suddenly dropped, somebody whose expenses have massively gone through the roof and has got no free money to spend, somebody who regularly spends large amounts on gambling immediately after being paid, is somebody who is either financially vulnerable or whose gambling habit actually exposes them to a level of risk that they may not have even considered. So financial risk is actually a much better platform for the industry. And as Matt says, it's all about using the technology that's now available to be able to access the data and process it in a fair and transparent way.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the current model at the moment is operators will maybe carry out these checks sporadically. There's no kind of real systems, or they have their own systems where they might restrict someone. They might be a case of thousands of people falling through that net. They might not have that kind of standardized and prescriptive regulation that they have to follow. So I think that's a problem. But also a problem is the regulators' approaches will sort of hope the operators do the right thing in this kind of outcomes-based approach. And if they don't, we will retrospectively assess their operation, their approach, and if we find that there's failings, we'll sanction them. Well, that way round, if the fines are big enough, maybe it will change behaviour in the sector. But we're seeing huge fines now, and I think what the operators need is proper guidance, proper prescriptive guidance that can be applied across the sector, that is standardised, every operator has to follow, and that will prevent these cases happening in the first place, because we've already had a massive record Entain fine. There's going to be another one for 2 large operators on the way. So these are all for the same failings. So and I think that the regulator really has a responsibility to set the standard.
And illegal gambling makes up a huge chunk of the overall market, and particularly in countries that have stricter regimes than our own. Do you think that we are at risk of going down the same path if reform goes too far?
Well, I think that, first of all, I'm an advisor to YieldSec. YieldSec uses counter-terrorism technology to get an accurate picture of the black market and what's going on in different jurisdictions and where that traffic's coming from. My view is that the regulator needs to get a proper picture of that, of what's happening. And I think that there are enforcement tools at its disposal if it has the resources, which we hope will come in the Gambling Act review. There are tools at its disposal where it can tackle the black market and cut it off its source. So then we don't get into this kind of discussion about, oh, if we do too much regulation, will that lead to more illegal gambling? The illegal gambling shouldn't even be an option. There are things that the regulator can do, such as tackling payment processors, content suppliers, internet service providers, Google, working with the search engines. Lots of things they can do to tackle the black market. And really, it should give the regulator that freedom and scope to regulate in the way that it wants to.
It's technically and operationally extremely difficult to put up a wall, stop people from using it. I mean, but for sure, make it as hard as possible. I mean, particularly through the payments side of things, that's the easiest way to stop it. But at the end of the day, unless the environment for gambling legally is safe and accessible, you will never remove the incentive of people. And there are some things that we could fix very, very easily. So if you take self-exclusion, for example, people can self-exclude on one particular site and then go and open an account at another one and carry on playing. There's no centralized mandate, which you get in some of the US states, actually. It's quite interesting that they're even ahead of us. And there are some things that we could do that could really begin. But ultimately, I think we need to change the conversation between the operator and the player. And it needs to go from being in a sort of an adult to child relationship where one's telling the other one what they can and cannot do, to an adult to adult based on mutual respect and understanding. And they both need to come to the process with the view that this is an entertainment service that shouldn't be allowed to get out of hand. And it happens to some people and not to others. And it shouldn't be a matter of shame. And it shouldn't be this sort of intrusive, these affordability checks, as they're so called now, just extraordinary inquisitions that players have to go through.
Yeah. And that's not from the regulator. That's the operators thinking, like panicking, because they're trying to find the way of...
Yeah, it's defensive, and they don't know when they do it and how they do it or what to do with the information. And the player, some players are just at their wits' end. I mean, the stuff that was in the Racing Post over the last week or two is just extraordinary. And the technologies exist, but the incentives don't exist. And I think that just relying on a stream of police actions, of fining people, isn't going to do it.
Fantastic. I've got so many more questions. I wish we had more time. We've run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much. It's obviously such a hot debate at the moment. So thank you for coming in and discussing it with us. So we've come to the end of this morning's broadcast, where we have explored the future of the UK gambling market and at a point where it could be facing massive changes. It's been fascinating to hear from those at the forefront of this change, whether that's developing new products and processes to help operators better protect customers or working to reshape the sector. And of course, a special thank you to Andrew Rhodes for joining us and giving viewers an exclusive insight into the work of one of the biggest and best regarded regulators worldwide. It's also great to see Andy back at the Consumer Protection Zone, which this year has raised £52,800 that will be allocated to charities and treatment providers across the sector. As ever, we're keen to find out what you think. You viewers, we want to know what you're thinking. Get in touch on Twitter at ICE365Global or through LinkedIn using the hashtag ICE365Global. After the break, we're off to Latin America. According to H2 Gambling Capital, interactive gross win from LATAM and the Caribbean is expected to rise from $3 billion in 2022 to $7.1 billion by 2027. At a compound annual growth rate of 18.3%, the second highest rate of growth for any region other than North America. This makes Latin America a growing and potentially crucial new source of players and revenue for the industry. Join us from 1:30 to find out more from those in the know. I'll see you then.